So tonight's going to be our last night in the life of Joseph. And what I want to do, and this whole theme of Joseph is a God-sized life takes a God-sized dream. So I want everyone in this room to be able to live like an amazingly big life for Jesus. And I want to show you right now a scripture that seems like it has nothing to do with Joseph, but I think it has everything to do in understanding his life. So I want to show you one of the scariest verses in the Bible. Go to the next slide. This is Matthew chapter 7. This is verses 21 through 23. And what's happening here, you have Jesus. He's doing one of his biggest sermons ever. He has like this crowd of hundreds or thousands of people just listening to him. And this is what he says at one point in his sermon. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not drive out demons in your name? And did we not perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoer. And I think, like, how terrifying is that verse right there, that if you honestly think about it, you have Jesus, and he says one day he's going to be eyeball to eyeball to people, and he is literally going to say to them, I never knew you, like I never had a relationship with you. He's going to tell people to get away from me, and that seems so unlike Jesus, because we always talk about Jesus like telling people to come to him, but there's going to be a day when Jesus tells people to go away from him. And here's the scary thing about all this. If you look at verse 21, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but who enters heaven? Those who do the will of my Father in heaven. That Jesus says those who get to go to heaven are those who do the will of God. And the scary thing about that verse, I think about this, is not prophesying in your name. Is that not your will? Is it not your will that we perform miracles? That outwardly they're doing everything I think that would be the will of God. And yet Jesus said they completely missed his will. So the question then becomes this. So then what is doing God's will? So if you were to look at this sermon, it's actually Matthew chapters 5 through 7. This is the sermon Jesus is preaching. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And a lot of the Sermon on the Mount, it's not really what you do, it's really who you are. That a lot of Jesus' sermon is about your heart. And I think that's the difference between Christianity and religion. That religion is really concerned about your outward actions. It is about, controlling what you do outwardly, and it never touches your heart. While Jesus and Christianity, what he's really concerned about is not so much what you do, but the condition of your heart. Because he knows if he gets your heart right, right actions will follow. So I want you to grab this. If you take notes, write this down. Jesus isn't so concerned with what you do as much as he's concerned with who you are. I'll say that again. Jesus isn't so concerned with what you do as much as he's concerned with who you are. That what Jesus really wants to grab is your heart. And I wonder if we're honest with ourselves, where do we find ourselves in this? Are we more concerned with our outward actions, or are we more concerned with the inward condition of our hearts? And when I talk about the condition of your heart, a great indicator, like a great way to know if you really belong to Jesus, are you a forgiving person? Are you a person that practices forgiveness? That as Christians, we should be the most forgiving people on the planet. And if we're honest, though, I don't know too many people that are naturally forgivers, that I think forgiveness might be one of the hardest things we do just as people. And there's actually this one YouTube video, it's kind of really messed up. There was this family, and they found this squirrel, and this squirrel was injured, and they took it in, and they nursed it back to health. And it's really heartwarming story. And okay, this shows like why I'm a terrible person. But anyway, so the squirrel is really sick, and they nurse it back to health. And then the husband and wife, they go outside, and they're like filming the release of this squirrel, and they put the squirrel like on this tree, and the man, he's petting the squirrel, and he's like, "Go, be free, little squirrel, go, climb up the tree." And it's like the squirrel looks back to acknowledge the kindness of the person, and he's like taken off this tree, and it's like the squirrel is like happy, he's going back to his like squirrel buddies, and it's like 5 seconds of freedom. This cat jumps up on the tree, grabs the squirrel, and then runs down with them, and the cat, it was their pet. Their pet killed the squirrel they nursed, and the last thing you hear in this video is this woman scream, "Tom, no, Tom!" And it's on YouTube. It's like I said, I'm a horrible person for like finding humor in that video, but the point is this: I'm really sorry. I think there's. Yeah, I'm sorry. So anyways, so the point of all that is this. Do squirrels forgive cats that chase them up trees? No, right? That forgiveness doesn't work in nature, right? You don't see animals forgiving each other for horrible things, right? Because our whole world, it doesn't work on the principle of forgiveness. Like forgiveness doesn't take place in nature. So when we talk about us as people, right? Forgiveness is going to be one of the hardest things you do. And yet if you understand forgiveness, chances are you really belong to God. So I think there's 2 reasons why forgiveness is so hard. And we're going to look at both these reasons in the life of Joseph. So let's go to the next slide. So what's happening here, you have Joseph, and his brothers are before him. His brothers came to get food because there's this huge famine going like all over the world, and they get to Egypt, and they meet Joseph, and this is what happens. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. And Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. So when Joseph sees his brothers, it's been years since he's seen them, and he speaks roughly to them, right? He speaks cruelly to them. And then you jump down on verse 14, it says this. Because his brothers are like, "Hey, like, why are you speaking so bad to us? Like, Joseph says you're spies." And they're like, "We're not spies." And at verse 14, but Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. And send one of you, and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether this is true, whether this is truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." And he put them all together in custody for 3 days. So the point I want you to get from this, why is forgiveness so hard? Slide. Forgiveness is hard because you have a right to be angry. Forgiveness is so hard because you have a right to be angry. That, think about Joseph's life, right? He's 17 years old, and his brothers throw him into this pit, right? And they talk about killing him, and then they don't kill him. They simply throw him into slavery. So Joseph spends his teenage years, and he spends a good part of his 20s as a slave in prison, right? If anyone had a right to be upset, it's Joseph. And for you, there's stupid things we get angry about, right? There's stupid things you probably shouldn't be upset about, but then there's real things that really happen to you, and they make you mad, and you have every right to be upset. So when you talk about forgiveness, it becomes really hard because you do have a right to be angry. And think about this. Joseph, he wants to see his youngest brother. Why does he want to see his youngest brother so bad? Because he loves Benjamin. Like his other brothers, he really doesn't care for. But Benjamin, he really loves, because him and Benjamin have the same mom. So that's why Joseph loves Benjamin so much. And they didn't bring Benjamin because his dad wouldn't let Benjamin come. So he says, I'm going to keep all of you in prison, right? And only one of you can go home. And I want one of you to go home because I want you to bring your youngest brother, because I want to see Benjamin. So forgiveness is hard because you have a right to be angry. So what's the second reason why is forgiveness hard? Next slide. So what happens here is this. Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter. So when Joseph says, I'm going to throw all you guys in prison, right, they all start arguing amongst themselves in their own language, and they didn't recognize Joseph, so that's why they didn't think Joseph could understand Hebrew. But they're arguing, and then Reuben says, okay, all this is happening to us because we were terrible to Joseph. And then verse 24, Joseph turned away from them and began to cry, but then came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Why is forgiveness hard? One, because you have a right to be angry. And two, slide, forgiveness is hard because you hurt deeply. Because you hurt deeply. Those two reasons is why forgiveness is so hard and why forgiveness is so unnatural for us as people, because somewhere along the line, someone did something to you, or whether someone was gossiping about you, or someone said something horrible, or someone picked on you, or they were mean, right? You're angry and you're hurting, and those two combinations makes forgiveness a difficult thing. So go back to that slide. So think about this. At one point, Joseph said this, I'm going to take every last one of you and throw you all in prison for 3 days, right? He says, and then he says only one of you can go home. But what does Joseph do? He doesn't put all of his brothers in prison. He only puts one, and he allows the others to go home. So even Joseph, right? He loves God, and you see Joseph, he's struggling with wanting to do the right thing, that he's angry, but he's also trying to serve God. So out of all his brothers, why did he take Simeon? Why is Simeon the one he put in jail? So the reason why, one possible reason why he took Simeon, because Simeon is the hothead of his family. Or any of you just naturally angry people, it doesn't take much to make you mad. Would anyone admit that? Okay, so if that's you, you are like Simeon. So what happened one day, Simeon had a sister, and she went to this town, and these guys ended up abusing his sister, and Simeon finds out what happens. So what does he do? Not only does he kill the men that hurt his sister, he goes throughout the town, and he kills every man in that city. Why? Because it wasn't enough that it's just the people that hurt his sister. Simeon held everyone accountable that didn't help his sister. So it's not that Simeon just wanted justice, he wanted revenge, and he was a hothead, that he hurt people that had nothing to do with the situation. So how does all that tie back to Joseph? Because remember, Joseph is a brat. Right? He was a brat in the beginning of the story, and some of your siblings might say you're a brat. So I'm not saying you're a brat, I'm just saying your siblings might say you're a brat, and I might agree with them on some, it all depends who you are. But moving on, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what I think. So you have Joseph, he's in his pit, right? And they're all saying kill him. Who do you think is probably saying that the loudest? Yes, probably Simeon. Simeon's the hothead. Joseph is constantly picking on his brothers. So Simeon is probably the one that says, hey, we should kill him, we should kill him. And Judah was the one that says, no, let's not kill him. Let's only put him in slavery. So when Joseph finally got his chance to get back at his brothers, right, he allows the others to go home, but he puts Simeon in prison. And I want to tie all that together, that you see in Joseph's heart, there's anger, there's sadness, and yet there's a desire for forgiveness. And I think that's where we are as Christians. that you know you should forgive people, but yet there's anger and there's sadness in your heart, and yet you desire to do the right thing. And I want to show you right now. Go to the next slide. This is a quote in one of my devotional books I've been reading. And when it comes to forgiveness, this quote has really helped me, and maybe it could help you as well. It says, "Awe your heart then with the authority of God in the scriptures, and when earthly thinking says, 'My enemy deserves to be hated,' let conscience reply, 'But does God deserve to be disobeyed?'" And for that is one of the most powerful quotes for me right there. That, remember, you have a right to be angry, right? You have a right to be upset with certain people, but in your right to be angry, does God deserve to be disobeyed by us? Because you always have a choice. We can hold on to our anger and disobey God, or we can obey God and choose to forgive. And I love how this quote ends, because we can say, "But so-and-so did this to me, and so-and-so did that to me." But what wrong has God done to you? That if God has done nothing wrong to us, we should listen to him. That if you want to know, when you are most like God, when you are forgiving, you are most like God when you are choosing to forgive others. And when God chooses to forgive us, we call that grace, right? Because it's something we don't deserve. Whenever you choose to show grace to someone, it's always unfair to you because you're choosing to let go of something, but that's what God does for us. Every time God shows us grace, it's always unfair to God, but God does that out of the goodness of his heart for us, which brings me to my next verse. So this is how we move on. Like, how do we move on to forgive others? So this is towards the end of his story when all of his brothers are back and they brought Benjamin and they're all like freaking out, like what's Joseph going to do to them? And it says this, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he cried so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard all about it," which brings me to my next point. Forgiveness frees you from living in the past. Forgiveness frees you from living in the past. That you see Joseph's life right here, and he chooses to forgive his brothers, and he's letting go of all the baggage. He's letting go of all the issues in his heart. And I want to share you a personal story from my life. There's someone I know in my life who I think started out as a really good person, but something in their past happened 40 years ago, and I don't think they ever let that go. And that person who I know, they live in the past 40 years ago in their heart, and that issue that they could never let go of has caused them so much pain in their present. And what does that have to do with you? Where are you currently living? Where are you currently living? Like, I know you're physically here right now, but are you a prisoner in your own heart? When you choose not to be a forgiving person, it makes you live in that moment forever in the past. And that's the last thing I want for you. Like, I don't want you to live in the past in something that horrible that happened to you, but I want you to be able to move on from that and have a good life. So I want to show you, actually go to my next slide. Does anyone know who that is? Oh, Caleb, please tell us. Okay, so quickly tell us his story.
So he was, let's say, 26. He had one kid who's 2 years old, and his wife is pregnant with his second kid. And he goes to the gym and comes back, and she's dead on the floor with like two bullets.
Yeah, so I remember hearing his story for the first time, and Caleb told us a story quite well. That you have this guy, he was in South Carolina, he moved to Indiana because he wanted to plant a church there, and he's planting this church in this not such a good neighborhood, and he goes to the gym, and he comes back, and his wife, who was pregnant, was murdered. And I heard his story for the first time, and I couldn't stop wanting to learn about this guy. And I came back from Momentum, and I began just like reading his blogs and reading his websites and just trying to get as much information on him as I could. And I came across this quote one day, and this is what he wrote. Slide. He wrote this: "People have asked me, how in the world can you forgive? I started realizing that if I continue to let bitterness and hatred fuel everything that I do, then it's going to perpetuate and blow up everybody that I care about around me." That I hear his story and I hear his answer, and he is so correct. That, guys, if you don't hear anything else I say tonight, I want you to hear this. If you choose not to forgive, you're gonna take your anger out on people that don't deserve it. That Davy made a decision. He realized he was still a father, and he still had to raise his son, and he was still a pastor. And if he didn't get to the point where he could forgive what happened to his wife, he was going to end up hurting his son. He was going to end up hurting his church. He was going to end up hurting everyone that God brought him in contact with. And that same truth is true for all of us in this room. That I said, I want you to have a God-sized life. Well, you cannot have a God-sized life if you live in the past of what happened to you, or if you live in what has happened to you. That you have to be able to live in the present to honor God. And how do you live in the present? Is when you make peace and you realize you're going to choose to forgive. But I guess here comes something that's really serious. Okay, maybe we say this: I don't have the ability to forgive, right? That Daryl, you don't know what happened to me, right? You don't know what someone said to me. You don't know what happened in my past. And I want to show you this verse. Actually, yeah, so right here you have Joseph. This is years later. What happened to Joseph and his brothers. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." And jumping down a little bit later, it says this, and right here. "But Joseph said to them, 'Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today.'" So the point I want you to grab is this. Slide. You are able to forgive when you look at your life through God's eyes. You are able to forgive when you look at your life through God's eyes. That Joseph took everything that happened to him and he funneled it through God. He says, "I know you meant bad for me, but God meant it for good." So there's this whole idea that God, Jesus says we're what? Starts with an S instead of a P. It goes bah. Sheep. You guys are all geniuses. Thank you. It's like we have ESPN together. Wait, that's yes. It's ESP. Thanks. Thank you, Tyson. I appreciate that. So we all have ESP together. So this whole idea, Jesus says we're his sheep, and that Jesus is our shepherd. And if you look at life, that Jesus is constantly leading you, regardless of what happens. That all the bad that happens, all the good that happens, you have Jesus being our shepherd, and he's leading us in life. Which brings me to this verse right here. So, and when they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments. That when Jesus is on the cross, experiencing the worst day of his life, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Which brings me to this. The power of Jesus lives in you to give you the ability to be a forgiving person. The power of Jesus lives in us to give us the ability to choose to forgive. And now I'm going to show you something maybe a lot of you haven't seen. Does anyone want to take a guess where this picture is from? Or what war? Yes, World War II. This is World War II, and this is Warsaw. This is the capital of Poland. And what happened here, you had the Nazis, and they invaded Poland, and they destroyed it, and they leveled it, that before they ever got to the Jews, they destroyed Poland. So after the war, 10 years later, German Christians, they came along, and they met up with some Polish Christians, and the German Christians said, we want to ask you for forgiveness. We want to apologize for what our country did to you. And one of the Polish Christians, he stood up in the room and he said this: every stone in Warsaw is covered in Polish blood. There's no way we can ever forgive you. And there's all this tension in this room, and there's just all this like anger and hurt, and the meeting wasn't going positive. But anyways, they all decided they were going to pray together, and they were going to pray this prayer of Jesus. And I want to show you what happened. So you have these Polish Christians and you have these German Christians, and they're coming together, and there's this lack of forgiveness, and they all pray together. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. And they all paused. No one continued with the prayer. And what happened? That same guy that stood up and said, I cannot forgive you because every stone in Warsaw is covered in Polish blood. He ended up saying these words. Slide. I must say yes to you. I could no more call myself a Christian if I refuse to forgive. Humanly speaking, I cannot do it, but God will give us his strength. And 18 months later, those Christians, those Polish and German Christians, came back together, and they have friendships that continued even throughout this day. And the whole point of that story is this. That guy admitted, he said, I cannot forgive you in my own ability, that in our own strength we cannot be forgiving people. But how do we do that? Because Jesus, who is the most forgiving person on the planet, he lives in our hearts. And if we allow him to lead us, that gives us the ability to forgive. When are you most like God? Is when you choose to forgive. If you're going to have a God-sized life, it's going to take God working on our hearts and to make us people that are going to be people that choose to forgive. So what I'm going to ask right now, I'm going to ask the band to come back up and lead us in our last song. And while they're doing that, I'm going to pray. Dear Jesus, I want to say thank you for tonight, and just thank you for the holiday of Christmas that's coming quickly. And during this whole season, you coming to show us how to live life, right? You coming to save us. You coming to make us right people, not so much in our actions, but you want us to have right hearts. And if we get right hearts, we'll do right things. And I just pray that you would help us to choose to forgive, that we would look at areas in our lives where it might be difficult to forgive and realize we have your strength, we have your power flowing in us to give us the ability to choose to forgive and not be prisoners in our hearts. We give this prayer in your name. Amen.